Okay, class, we've reached the fourth and final video in the Sweet 16+1 series. Now, it has been a difficult path, but it's one that ends not necessarily on an easy note. I saved the most difficult for last with this intention of that in order to get this one, you have to build to it and understand the others. So this one, what we're going to focus on today is mainly, there are four devices we're going to cover: juxtaposition, oxymoron, paradox, and antithesis. Now, if you notice, only one of them, if you look back at our original list, is actually in the diction category. The other three are in the syntax category. Now, even though they are all a form of juxtaposition, it's how they are actually used themselves that help to define and show if they are diction or if they are in the syntax category. Okay, so juxtaposition, I will move the camera for you, is a literary technique in which two or more ideas, places, characters, and their actions are placed side by side, making sure that you understand this importance of side by side. Okay? So they're next to each other in a narrative or poem for the purpose of developing comparisons and contrasts. So this is to show the similarities and the differences between something, so they're placed side by side, or they're juxtaposed, to give you this intention of one enhancing the other. Looking at some samples, this idea of something being good versus something being evil. They are complete opposites, but they are placed next to each other with this intention of being able to bring this contrasting evidence to pull you in there. So when you see characters like this, you might see in a story a good character and an evil character. It brings that together to show you that emphasis. This idea of light versus dark, or day versus night, fits in this as well, which the day versus night fits there. Hope versus despair, something positive versus something negative. And another one I did was this idea of a winner versus a loser. So authors use these a lot with this intention of showing that stark difference in there. Now, I'm going to put up a piece of literature here for you. This is a perfect example of a juxtaposition. So it shows the placement of the ideas side by side. It's comparing and contrasting. It's examples of these. But I want you to listen to what I am reading to you and listen to the differences and the contrasts it gives. Okay? So, it was the worst of time. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We are all going direct the other way. So each one of these sets, the best of times, the worst of times, age of wisdom, age of foolishness, these sets individually are an antithesis. Okay? So you notice, though, that there is a pattern here with how the author placed these words. The idea of the phrases themselves, everything is balanced, making it parallel. So bringing in the video from yesterday and this idea of that parallel structure is important. So, as a little mini thing, this is a very famous opening sentence in a novel. The first student, or the first 5 students, we'll do 5, to email me the title of this piece of literature, I will give a couple points of extra credit to on the upcoming quiz that you will have later this week. So first 5, so hopefully you watch this early and could figure this out quickly and get it to me. Okay, now the next 3 devices, so we talked about juxtaposition, and the next 3 devices are all part of juxtaposition. Okay, so the first one, oxymoron, is this idea of it placing two opposite ideas next to or near one another. It's not necessarily in a parallel fashion, but because they are next to each other or near in proximity, it fits as a syntax aspect. So a couple examples. Jumbo shrimp. Jumbo meaning large, shrimp meaning small. So it is those contrasting ideas and those opposites in there. So that idea fits in there. Another one, awfully pretty. Awfully is more or less ugly, but on the other side you have pretty. Another one, liquid gas. We say this when we're referring to, in chemistry, to a bunch of different things, but this idea of liquid, you cannot have a solid state and a gas state at the same time. So this also fits as an oxymoron. Now this last one shows this idea that you do not always have to have your oxymoron right next to each other like I did in the first three examples. In fact, you can have it near. So this example fits that. In order to lead, you must walk behind. So it's talking about this idea of leading, but it's also talking about this idea of walking behind. Because a leader normally is in the front of the line. But in actuality, it's saying that better leaders started out as followers, or understand followers, or are part of their group that they're actually leading. It shows that they're better. So when we look back at the King's speech where he's trying to be one of his people, he's actually walking behind and showing that aspect. So that is oxymoron. Sorry about that. If you heard a bell, it was my doorbell. Had to pause for a moment, but I'm back now to finish the video. Okay, so we've covered juxtaposition and we've covered oxymoron. Now we're going to look at this idea of paradox and antithesis. Now these are both forms of juxtaposition, but looking at this, remembering that paradox falls under the diction aspect and antithesis falls under the syntax aspect. So looking in mind, these are both juxtapositions. They both have that idea of opposites, but it's how they are written that decides if they're a paradox or an antithesis. So looking at the first thing, a paradox is a statement that appears to contradict itself. I'm going to show you some samples, so don't worry about that, but it contradicts. So noticing here, it doesn't say anything about structure. Antithesis, juxtaposition of contrasting ideas. So again, a contradiction in balanced phrases. So that balanced is this idea of parallelism. So it follows a set structure. Okay, so these are both juxtapositions, but the difference between them, paradox doesn't have a structure, antithesis does. Okay, move the camera so I can show you some ideas, leave the definitions there. Okay, to be or not to be. So the contrasting idea here is this idea of existence. So we have the idea of you do exist versus you do not exist. But if you look at this, we're looking at the idea of parallelism. Does it have, so the first main thing is, yes, we have opposite ideas, but do we have a parallel structure? Do we have something that's balanced, that follows the same pattern? So we have this idea of a verb, and we have this idea of a verb. This middle aspect doesn't really matter. It's more the idea that these are the same thing. So this I'm going to label with an A. This is an example of antithesis. Okay, when I'm labeling these, I will use the A and the P, since those are easier to write with the pen with my mouse. Okay, so the next one. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So this not only is an example of a chiasmus, because it goes country, you, country, so it fits that chiasmus. Now since it's a chiasmus, you should know right away that it follows a set pattern. Okay, and if it follows a set pattern, it's a parallelism. But it also has the opposites in there. So chiasmus usually has this idea of the opposites, this contrast, this juxtaposition. Okay, so definitely fits in there. So this is another example of an antithesis. Okay, next one. scrolling up. When Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, it might have been one small step for a man, but it was one giant leap for mankind. Now looking at here, so it's talking about a small step versus a giant leap. So we have those contrasting small versus big in there. But does it have a set parallel structure? So even though we have the opposite ideas here, they're not necessarily written in the same strict pattern that the previous two have been. Okay, so this I would put as an example of parallelism. Okay, next one. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. If you recognize this from 2 slides previously, it is the opening it's the opening 2 phrases from that piece of literature that I told you to email me about in order to get the extra credits. So because it comes from there, and looking at this idea of best versus worst, those are our opposites. So that is your contrasting idea, but looking then at the idea of how this is written. So it looks exactly the same. It was. So it's an anaphora, first of all, but then you also have the idea of the structure within it. There's the same number of words, there's the same placement. The only difference is the idea of best versus worst. So this is an anaphora. Okay, one more, and then I'm going to actually have you try some on your own. The child is father of man. So this idea of a child versus a father. So this is our contrasting ideas, child and father. Now the idea here is that next thing we check and we look at is this idea of parallelism. So yes, it has the contrasting ideas, but does it have a parallel structure? The answer is no. In order to be parallel, it would have to be something along the lines of the child is the father of man. So because it doesn't, we have a paradox. Okay, now I'm going to scroll down, show you a couple more. I want you to write these in your notes, and we're going to use these to discuss at the beginning of class tomorrow. This is important that we spend some time in class on this discussion, because when we take this quiz, it is important that you understand this difference between the two. This idea of contrasting ideas is important, but the structure it uses is even more important. So once you look at them, go ahead and pause it so that you can actually write these 3 down, and tomorrow we will discuss them in class before we get started on the next part of the chapter. Have a good night, and I'll see you tomorrow.